Hey everybody, TacticAngel back on the PlayStation to take a look at the ship history for the Imperial Japanese Navy aircraft carrier Zuiho, which appears in World Warships Legends as a Tier 5 premium carrier. My review of Zuiho should appear below once it is available, but today it's just the history, so let's just jump right into it. The history of the Zuiho begins, as so many of our stories do, as a result of the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty, and the growing antagonism between the United States and the Empire of Japan. That disagreement basically boils down to the US telling Japan really ought to treat its neighbors better, and Japan having a mind to tell the states to mind their own business. In any case, the US levied sanctions against Japan, and that had very little effect on Japan's conduct on mainland Asia, except that from their perspective, they were gonna have to do something to get Uncle Sam off their back. The smart money was always on that the Empire of Japan never really had much of a chance of defeating the United States militarily unless they could demoralize America enough that they sued for peace. And the Japanese naval planners largely knew that, so when the Washington Naval Treaty came along, they would come up with strategies that largely fit into three categories: lawyering, planning ahead, and then just plain old lying and cheating. And what rules they started with were from the Washington Naval Treaty. That stated that an aircraft carrier is defined as a vessel of war with a displacement in excess of 10,000 tons, yada yada yada, something about planes. So, if you build a ship that weighed a little less, no one could call it an aircraft carrier, no matter how many planes you saw land or take off from it. The theory here is that you just couldn't build a useful fleet carrier on that kind of tonnage, and Japan said, "Hold my beer," and then built the 8,000-ton Ryujo. And as far as hold your beer moments go, Ryujo really wasn't that bad of an outcome, but it also wasn't a very good carrier. It had poor stability, the hull was too weak to resist the twisting forces of the sea, and though they wouldn't be able to tell this at the time, when Ryujo was sunk, it was by one torpedo and 3 bombs, and frankly the bombs probably weren't even necessary. By the time that she was refit several times to fix many of those issues and to expand her hangars, she was over 10,000 tons anyway. That is to say, the Ryujo as initially built wasn't effective enough a carrier to warrant her having any sister ships, and the definition of carrier was changed in the London Naval Treaty to be more expansive, so these sort of shenanigans no longer resulted in clearly existent, non-existent carriers. Alright boys, back to the drawing board. We have a maximum allowable tonnage for carriers, and we know we want to be way over that tonnage, because if we're going to take on America, plus the British Empire, while still screwing around in Manchuria, we're going to need all the help we can get. Though Japan would sign on to the first London Naval Treaty, they opted out of the second, and openly breaking the treaty in certain ways was going to create a naval arms race that really wasn't in their best interest. The whole problem is that America and Britain were both allowed to have larger fleets under those arrangements, and once a war started, or even an arms race, both had considerably greater industrial output, so there was really no way to leapfrog them. And that's to ignore the straight up lying part about Yamato being a 16-inch battleship, and that would work so long as no one got all that close to her guns with a tape measure in hand. Hiding that they were building more aircraft carriers than were allowed was another issue altogether. Aircraft carriers tend to look a certain way, so they had to be creative. What they decided to do was build a series of ships that could serve some other purpose, like being a submarine or float plane tender, but which could, in the event that they needed additional aircraft carriers, be brought into dock with the superstructure torn away and replaced with a hangar superstructure and flight deck atop it, and boom, there's your aircraft carrier in a matter of weeks. This isn't the absolute best way of building an aircraft carrier. Japan probably knew as well as anyone else that was the case, but these ships weren't laid down as battleships or cruisers that suddenly had to change their whole raison d'etre. The engines could still be where you would expect to find them, and spaces which could become magazines were where they made the most sense, which is a bit different than the Independence class, which sort of just ended up with magazines in barbette spaces for guns they didn't have. And in this, the Japanese Navy had a creative idea, even if it was kind of the same idea. Let's build carriers that don't count as carriers. Though there were other ships with similar histories, the Zuiho was laid down in June 1935 under the name Takasaki, with the on-paper intention that she would be the second Tsurugizaki-class submarine tender. She was launched a year later in June 1936, but before being completed with this faux secondary purpose, conversion to a carrier began immediately. It would last, surprisingly, until December 1940. She would stay in Japan until October 1941, where she briefly sailed to Formosa, better known today as Taiwan. After that, she sailed east into the Pacific with Hosho as part of the 3rd Carrier Division. Though she was not part of the 1st Air Fleet, also known as the Kido Butai, she served as escort and air defense during the attack on Pearl Harbor. Zuiho spent the beginning of 1942 in Japanese waters, but would again depart with the bulk of the Japanese Navy when they sailed into the middle of the Pacific again. This was for the Battle of Midway, which naturally didn't go quite as well for the Japanese carrier force. Here, Zuiho was in support of the landing force under Admiral Kondo. So when Hiryu, the last of the fleet carriers still standing in the battle, took off with the rest of the mobile strike force hoping to force a surface engagement with the American fleet, Zuiho was still 200 miles away, not really involved, and was able to slip away to the west at night without incident. She'd retire to the Japanese stronghold on Truk Atoll, but not for long, sailing for Guadalcanal in October 1942. Here, the air group of the Zuiho would tangle with the legendary American aircraft carrier USS Enterprise. Though her air group by now consists mostly of Zeros to be used as interceptors and got the best of 6 American aircraft while taking 4 losses, these planes were ultimately not able to dissuade the American attack group, who would damage Zuiho's flight deck, forcing her to return to Truk for temporary repairs and then back to Japan. By the time she returned to frontline service, it was January 1943, and she was in support of the evacuation of Japanese forces from Guadalcanal. Though in actuality, most of her air wing would operate out of forward bases on nearby islands while the carrier remained near Truk. By the time of her next major engagement, most of Zuiho's flight group consists of relatively green pilots, and she was being operated next to other converted light carriers, Chitose and Chiyoda. The carrier group launched a total of 64 aircraft towards one of the most lopsided aircraft engagements in naval history. This was the Battle of the Philippine Sea, or the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, take your pick. Only 21 planes would return to these 3 carriers, while the remaining managed only a single hit that caused superficial damage to USS South Dakota. The Zuiho's air group would never be fully replenished after this point, and she had only one major engagement left in her career, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. By now, the 3 converted light carriers were operating beside the last of the Shokaku-class fleet carriers, the Zuikaku. Between the 4 carriers, they would launch just over 100 planes against the American fleet. The attack was cut down before it could reach its target, and while the Americans were not able to respond the same day, they were able to shadow the carrier group throughout the night. And the following day, Admiral Halsey ordered an attack by 180 aircraft against the mostly depleted carriers. 13 Zeros attempted to intercept the attack, but you can kind of figure how the numbers game is going to work from here. The Zuiho suffered a single hit to her flight deck, which hampered her ability to defend herself as well as causing fires and floods within the ship. She was able to largely deal with this damage and was ignored during the second attack that singled out and eventually sunk Chiyoda. By 1 p.m., a third wave of American attack aircraft took aim at Zuiho, though. She was hit a few more times by bombs with an aerial-launched torpedo and was further damaged by dozens of near misses. The ship was flooding badly, which would eventually cut power throughout the ship. At about 2:20 in the afternoon, the 4th wave of American aircraft assailed the helpless Zuiho, prompting an order to abandon ship. Zuiho would finally succumb to her wounds around 3:10 in the afternoon on October 25, 1944, with a loss of 215 officers and sailors. The majority of her crew, nearly 760 men, were rescued by other elements of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The discerning listeners out there will note that the Battle of Leyte Gulf is where so many American pilots had to ditch due to the extreme ranges involved in returning to the fleet, but this does round out the history of the Zuiho. Hope you've enjoyed the video. I will, of course, place the link to my review down in the comments once it's available, and as always, I hope to see you on the next one.